Trauma informed is a term, again, being used. People see it and they're like, oh, I know what trauma is. I know that it exists. So I'm just going to slap that word in front of my name in a profile or use it as a marketing or SEO, tactic, which is
Mhm.
incorrect and misleading because we're negating the origins and history of this approach. This isn't something that just became trendy in the last few years. This isn't some semantic kind of marketing adjective. It's an action.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize the conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented.
Where are you from? Really? No, originally, where are you from? Can I touch your hair? Your English sounds so good. Nah, I don't see color. Those statements I've shared are just some of the daily microaggressions that people of color face on a regular basis when they occupy white spaces. Microaggressions are subtle yet negative racial messages that leave the person on the receiving end feeling hurt, humiliated, and even disrespected. You may have used these kinds of statements to start a conversation or even break ice with a person of color, but didn't realize the harm you were causing. That's why I've created a free microaggressions guide with 5 of the commonly made microaggressions in online coaching spaces that you need to know about and what you can do or say instead. Head over to anikishuru.com/micro to download your free guide. That's Anikishuru, GICHURU.com/micro, MICRO. This week on the podcast, I've got the wonderful Katie Kurtz, and we're talking all things being trauma informed. She is the go-to for this work, in my opinion. And the conversation that we've just had, I've just finished recording the episode, really diving into understanding what trauma is, because it's gotten into a place where the word trauma has become like a buzzword where people are using it, and it's getting used out of context. So we dive into that a little bit more. But more so, we talk about the interconnectedness and the relationship between social justice work, anti-racism, liberation, and how that intersects with being trauma-informed. And we go deeper and talk about, being a space holder. What does it mean to be trauma aware and to be trauma informed? And what do you need to have in order to hold, safer spaces? Now, before we go into the episode, let me tell you who Katie is. Katie Kurtz is a verified subject matter expert and trainer who specializes in integrative trauma-informed care. As a licensed social worker and certified coach, she has spent over 15 years specializing in trauma-informed training and consultation across multiple disciplines and industries. Katie is the author of the Reflective Self-Care Tool, the Contain Card Deck, and host of a Trauma-Informed Future podcast, which I highly recommend you check out. Additionally, she is the regional co-chair of the State of Ohio's Trauma-Informed Care Collaborative, subject matter expert with the Integrative Network, adjunct professor at Case West, Western Reserve University, and Cleveland State University social work graduate programs. Katie's leadership and work has been awarded and internationally recognized within both the social work and coaching fields. Here is Katie Kurtz. Hey there, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Represented Podcast with me, Annie Gishiru. And today is such a treat because I'm joined by Katie Kurtz, and we're just going to get straight into it. Welcome, Katie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
I have been waiting to have this conversation for quite some time, and there's so much to talk about, especially given the political climate in the US right now, where it's like it's gotten to fever pitch, and there's a lot to unpack there based on the work that you do. But I want to begin very simply by asking the question, what is trauma?
The easiest question you could possibly start with, right, Annie? So trauma is a response. It's our bodies actually brilliantly responding to stimuli or a trigger or something. That response is to keep us safe and to protect us, to survive. However, what may come from that response could be a myriad of things: physical symptoms, cognitive, social, relational, etc., to protect and survive. And now there's many different kind of variations of this definition because it's so nuanced and complex. And as humans, we really want tangible, right? And there's a very outdated understanding of trauma that most people today are still functioning from, that trauma are certain types of events: war, violence, injury. And when we think of it in very narrow terms that way, we begin to other. We say, oh, that's just those people. It's not me. That's not my community. But what we know after multiple years of studies and research and just people bravely sharing their lived experiences is that it's not certain events and environments. Now, with nuance, we know violence of any kind is inherently going to create some form of trauma. But the reality is trauma is not the event or environment. It is our response to events, environments, relationships that is beyond our capacity to cope with at the time, that threatens our stability, our security, our safety, our humanity. And so trauma itself is our nervous system, our neurobiological systems responding to some sort of threat or direct harm to keep us safe. So when we think of it that way, it's very nuanced and complex because each of us is going to respond very differently.
Absolutely.
And we also can respond collectively, culturally, communally.
Yeah, and as you were speaking, I was thinking of terms that I've heard before, such as big T and little t. What's your take on that?
I honor that approach. So for those unfamiliar, big T trauma is like a capital T, which kind of encompasses larger scale, inherently traumatic experiences that cause or typically lead to what we know as post-traumatic stress disorder. Little t trauma, so lowercase t, really depicting smaller everyday occurrences that are a little more stressful, but not necessarily deemed this big traumatic event. I honor why we differentiate it, again, because as humans, our brains love to try to make things tangible, either or, so that we can better understand it. And we struggle as humans with the capacity to hold nuance. However, I do not subscribe to that belief. I do not teach that belief. I used to way back when, but now I learned differently and I changed my mind. And now I know that trauma is trauma. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. It's a response to what's going on. And that it's a spectrum, certainly, that, experiencing one type of trauma response to one certain thing is very different than maybe large scale war, violence, etc. But when we start to compare and contrast and create hierarchy, we're just using the same tools that cause trauma to define it and to create meaning, and that doesn't help anyone. So I really like to look at trauma as a spectrum and focus more on, instead of comparing, looking more at understanding, listening, and building our capacity to hold that nuance.
Trauma is a word that has been used and misused to the point where I think people can get a little bit desensitized to it. Oh, I was so traumatized when I, saw what that child did, and maybe they just, did something that's an everyday thing that a child would do. How we just use it in everyday language. How does that impact this work? Because then people tend to arrive at this work differently because it's been so normalized. We've become so desensitized to it. Are there cons to doing that?
So I hold the and both here, right? Nuance. I am very much aware as a trauma specialist how much we're utilizing the word trauma, traumatized, and the buzziness we're giving it or the trendiness we're giving it. It's simultaneously occurring as we see more people utilizing therapeutic speak in everyday language. And there's two folds to this coin, right? There's two sides. It's great because what we're seeing terms and concepts of our humanity, very deep parts of our humanity, finally being vocalized, seeing people start to break through the stigma, feeling compelled to share their lived experiences. And that breaks stigma, which increases visibility and access to resources. On the flip side, we're still functioning from a misunderstanding of what trauma is. Most people who use it like, oh, I got the wrong coffee order, I'm so traumatized. Well,
Yeah.
okay, when we flippantly use it like that, we're disregarding the very real lived experiences of people who've experienced trauma, which we know is virtually all of us have or will. And what we're really seeing is when I see people do that, what I'm really seeing is this misunderstanding between discomfort, hurt, pain, and harm. And again, our lack of capacity to understand those different levels and what they mean. The other side of this is that a lot of times people hear trauma and they go, oh, can you just use a different word? Like it's so negative, it's such a like find a different term. And again, I get that, right? Because as humans, when we hear certain words, they conjure certain images. And then those images create our perceptions. And so typically when we think of trauma, we think of really bad things, really negative things. And so we don't have capacity to be with that discomfort. Therefore, we want to hide and avoid. So I get that. And I push back on that because trauma is not a bad word. Again, it's our bodies brilliantly doing what they're designed to do. And when we equate it to being quote unquote bad, when we avoid naming things for what they are, we are not only discounting the realities of our humanity that virtually everyone is experiencing or will experience, but we're also avoiding the topic. And we need to be naming things for what they are. I will continue to use the word trauma. I will help educate and shift people into better understanding what that means and encouraging people to find better words. But that's really what I'm seeing most commonly right now.
Another thing that's probably gotten a lot of traction as well is within the coaching industry, people saying, I'm trauma informed. I'm trauma informed. What is the difference between being trauma informed and being trauma aware? Because I also think a lot of people are grabbing onto these terms to showcase who they might be. And then you do get into their spaces and they are not what you thought they were. So is there a difference between being aware and being informed? And what would you categorize as somebody who has done this work or continues to do the work? Because I know with being trauma informed, it's not something that you can arrive at and go like, yeah, I did that work with Katie Kurtz. I'm good now. I'm sorted. It's an ongoing journey. It's an evolution.
There's a big difference between being aware of trauma and being informed. So there's two different competency levels I like to think of them as. Trauma awareness means I have an understanding of what trauma is. Maybe I gathered that understanding from my own lived experiences or witnessing someone in my life. Perhaps it's through some sort of media outlet, podcast, books, or just Googling my way there, right? Like anything, awareness is awareness. It means you have some understanding and knowledge, but that's kind of it. When we have awareness of something, it's just something that kind of it's kind of floating around. It's not tangible. The difference between trauma awareness and trauma informed is it's a leap, because the difference is action. Trauma informed is a term, again, being used. People see it and they're like, oh, I know what trauma is. I know that it exists. So I'm just going to slap that word in front of my name in a profile, or use it as a marketing or SEO, tactic, which is incorrect and misleading, because we're negating the origins and history of this approach. This isn't something that just became trendy in the last few years. This isn't some semantic kind of marketing adjective. It's an action. It's a long-standing historical approach that is utilizing the understanding of trauma, stress, and healing to then inform cultivated skills around relationship building, communications, discernment, decision-making, critical thinking, self-awareness, collaboration. It's a lens through which you lead your life. And it's applied. It's not something new. It's applied to how you run your business, how you do your marketing, how you do anything. So it's not an adjective to describe. It is a verb of action. You should be able to see it and feel it from somebody when they say they're trauma informed.
Wow. Ooh, okay. I think people are going to have to play that back again, because that is just so important to know. Because yes, that word is just being thrown around, SEO or for whatever, to attract clients, and it can be really harmful. And so want to shift gears now that we've gotten that baseline education of what trauma is. I have to talk about what's currently going on in the United States where you're based, Katie. The political climate in America, it's an election year, and a lot has changed over the last few weeks. And so for you as a space holder, I would love to know, how are you doing?
Annie, for context purposes, I live in the US, but I live in the state of Ohio, which is a Midwestern state, I guess you can say, and one of the vice presidential candidates, JD Vance, is from my state. So just for context, if you ever heard of that name, I was feeling quite hopeless lately, the last 4 years, the last several years. And when the assassination attempt occurred, I felt like a sinking, like a really sinking feeling, and exhausted, and like, how are we, like, what are we gonna do? And I am myself, my family and friends, we're politically aware, involved, informed. We could always do more, but compared to most, we do the best we can. And when Biden stepped aside and endorsed Kamala Harris, VP Kamala Harris, the last week, 10 days have felt like bungee jumping into hope. I don't know how to, like, I hold again the nuance that this is not, we need to look at, here in the US, we tend to pedestal presidents as these perfect beings, and they're not. There's always flaws. We should not be looking for perfection, and we shouldn't be looking to one person. And I hold the nuance that there's a lot I agree with, and with Kamala and the platform, but there's also a lot of things I believe we need to be pressuring for policy shifts, especially when it comes to what's happening in Gaza. And and a variety of other things. But I can't deny the sense of hope that I have felt that maybe we can, like, we're voting between democracy and fascism. It's that dire. And it's this has been the reality is like this could, if Trump wins, this could be the last time we have the right to vote. So that's like the direness of this. It's not flippant. And so to see Win with Black women, you know, have been meeting every Sunday or close to every Sunday for 4 years. They happened to have their meeting that Sunday. The timing couldn't be perfect. And they gathered thousands of Black women to raise money. And, you know, we have put so much pressure and have leaned so much on Black women to elect progressive people in this country. Black women are the backbone, and they shouldn't have to be, because it's unfair labor, unpaid labor, et cetera. It's a whole other podcast. But what happened was the catalyst of them Black men gathering and raising money, and then white women, and then white men, and Latinas for Kamala, and Native to Spirit, and LGBTQ. And now there's like cat ladies and dog owners and all sorts of these type of caucuses or affinity groups. And it's, you know, I think of how I was hopeless, and then I just sprung. I felt like I drink espresso every 5 minutes, because it's feeling like it's giving me Obama feels a little bit, but like of the energy and hope that was generated from that. But it's different. And so I'm clearly still processing, but there's a lot of work that has to be done. And I hope we can keep this momentum. And I hope people can actually, you know, there's this very popular, I understand the assignment. I hope, as a white woman, and I hope other white women, because white women elected Trump 4 years ago. And I hope that we truly understand the assignment and vote and put our dollars and time into this election, and then keep showing up. And decentering ourselves, and doing this work we should have been doing a long time ago. So it's a really wild time to be alive here in the US. We have a lot of work to do over the next 98 days. I am hopeful. I'm signed up to volunteer and do a lot of things, and activating my community, especially looking at local elections. But this is where we also have to practice trauma-informed care of honoring our capacity, honoring our pace, mutual aid, reciprocity, and trauma-informed self-care. And also that, again, this is a long game. That yes, we hit certain peaks, and this election in November is a peak, but it doesn't drop. We keep going. It's a long game. It's an evolution. And so if we want real change, so we don't have to do this again in 4 years, we need to look at finding regulation in our collective nervous system. And that means continuing to show up and really looking at healing these deep wounds that exist within our country.
Mm-hmm. Wow, what a very open way of sharing. And the world is watching. We are all watching. There's something about the US that, especially during an election year, everybody is just congregating and watching, and just we feel like it does affect us. It does affect us in many, many ways, because of the status, the power that the United States holds. And so we are watching. And you know, as you were sharing there about how you know, the energy has really shifted. And thank you for giving context about where you're based, where you're located, and that JD Vance is from that state. Thank you for sharing that. For those who will understand and read between the lines, they will understand. But tell me, and you've said this before, and this is what connects us with the work that I do as a racial equity coach. and you being, this expert, this specialist in your space, anti-racism and liberation work are inherently intersected with trauma-informed care. Somebody hearing that, quote, that statement for the first time or have heard it before, could you explain what it actually means? Because I have had students who have come into my program represented, having come from your space of being trauma informed, and not yet quite seeing the correlation until they start doing anti-racism work and they're like, oh my goodness, there is an intersection. You cannot separate the two. And now I am doing it in a way that I never thought I would be doing. I'm going so much more deeper. In fact, just to paint a picture here for you, there was somebody who is maternal care space holder for moms with newborns. And she said she had been doing this work thinking that she was absolutely inclusive, but what she was somebody who was trauma informed for white women. But after doing anti-racism work, she was like, now I can actually see myself being more inclusive, understanding, and having that lens of the biases I hold, the racist views that I have brought into my work. And so is being a lot more aware and a lot more inclusive intentionally because of the work they've done in anti-racism. Could you shed a little bit of light for somebody who's not even seeing the correlation here?
Absolutely. I first just want to name that's a great example of the difference between being aware and informed. It's because there is going to be awareness with our trauma-informed care. We have to be aware. We have to be attuned, not just seeing, but listening deeply. And it's the informed piece is then I am aware, and then what am I doing to center that awareness? What am I doing then what are those skills, those tools, those actions? That's where the difference lies. So trauma-informed care is a longstanding approach. There's not one or origin or author, but there is this timing, and we know that likely similar things, although it may not have been named this, was happening prior. But around the end of 1960s, early 1970s, we started to see this interesting intersection of things happening, these really historical things happening like around the world, but specifically in the US. We saw military people coming back from the Vietnam War and starting to display what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. This was during the same time as the civil rights movement, as the LGBTQIA movement, and the rape crisis movement. If you're not familiar with what the rape crisis movement, it's a movement to create and establish rape crisis centers for sexual assault survivors, and simultaneously also looking at child abuse advocacy. So all these things were happening at this time. And we started to see, yes, a lot of clinical professionals, healthcare professionals starting to notice signs and symptoms, but really activists, advocates, and survivors, people we're never going to know the names of, people who are not listed in the books or authors of the journals. They were ones at the helm of protests and hearings and showing up, advocating for their lived experiences to be honored and for professionals to stop causing further re-traumatization and harm. So I always like to name that. And I've had quite a few people protest against that because they want tangible evidence. And this is, again, why this is so important. Those movements, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQIA movement, the rape crisis movement, who were at the helm? Black women, Native women, women of color. And everything we see now in trauma-informed care is originated there, and that is social justice frameworks. It's social justice theory, it's social justice movements. These things, these concepts are not new, right? Slowing down, rest, these are not new concepts. They're originated in Indigenous people, in women of color, and especially Black, brown, queer folks. And so, yes, I wish I had their names. I wish I could have their books and everything, but They were not given those opportunities or even listened to. So I like to make sure we know the origins so that even though we don't know their names and we can say their names, we know that trauma-informed care is rooted in social justice frameworks. So then what we saw over time is people who did have that privilege, power, and advantage start to realize, oh yeah, they're right. We should probably study this and formulate it. And so what happened over the years is that's what's happened. And the term trauma-informed care was coined, and then it was formalized into an approach. Not very long ago, between 2012 and 2014 is really when we saw this formalized. That's not long ago, 10 years. And it was really established or formalized from what we know today by a government agency here in the US called the Substance Abuse Mental Health Administration Services. So they kind of look over all of our human services, mental health services. And they brought all these people together to write a really long paper and all sorts of things to say, like, this is what trauma-informed care is. It's an approach. And there are 4 main kind of things to think about. We need to recognize what it is, recognize what trauma is, make sure that we are, being responsive. And then it creates these principles of safety, trust, mutuality, cultural responsiveness, because in it, they already baked in that this is rooted from those frameworks, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. And they purposely did that because they wanted it to be kind of this fluid thing that you could take and adapt. Yeah. And we've seen it adapt into many things. So I love talking about this because I nerd out on trauma-informed care. I love it. But I think it's so important to tie back to the question you had before. This is not a trend or a buzzword. Mm-hmm. If we are doing a disservice and an injustice to those advocates and survivors and activists, those social justice, racial equity survivors and people at the helm, by just thinking this is buzzy. It's not. It's rooted. It has deep roots. And if we think about trauma from that expanded version as a response, let's think about anti-racism and liberation work. We understand the insidious nature of microaggressions. Microaggressions are a great example because they're not always, overt. They can be really insidious, right? They become normalized, quote unquote, but they're stressful, right? And they kind of dig at people, and then till it becomes completely cracked. That's stressful. That's toxic stress, accumulation of toxic stress, one thing after another. That we know toxic stress has the same imprint on our biology as trauma. Racism, oppression, these are inherently violent things. And we know violent is inherently traumatic. So again, nuance here. I'm never going to say someone, oh, that's trauma, you have trauma. I'm never going to come that way. And that's not what trauma-informed care is. But instead, pausing, widening, and expanding our lens of awareness and empathy to say, everyone is carrying an intersection of identities and lived experiences, and we exist in social context. So it's not just an individual's experience of racism or oppression, but then we're existing in all the social contexts where we live, where we work, where we school, where we get help, where we get healthcare. So they're intersected. They're not the same, but I very firmly believe that we cannot be trauma-informed if we're not simultaneously looking at anti-oppression and anti-racism. But then on the flip side, also liberation work, because liberation and healing are also intersected. So our trauma-informed care is incomplete if we're only applying it to white people. Yeah. And that's not, notice what comes up. Again, you may think it's harmful for me to say that, but I would guarantee you're probably feeling discomfort. And that's okay, because trauma-informed care builds our capacity. Racial equity work builds our capacity to be with the discomfort, opt for curiosity over judgment, and then unlearn, choose a different way of thinking. And they're both long games. So we can't, if anti-racism work was a short sprint, we'd be out of work, which would be great, right? But it's a long game. And so they're parallel practices, and they go hand different, but hand in hand.
They do. And so just taking a step back, going back to self-care, going back to holding everything that's happening. And especially as somebody who is in different spaces, you've got a membership, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. You're occupying different spaces. You're going to, you're in academia. You have different, stakeholders that you're taking care of. How does one then take care of yourself, because you're giving so much? What does self-care really look like for somebody who is in this space?
Yeah. So when I first learned about trauma-informed care, I actually studied with and learned it from SAMHSA. So that group, at the time it was being published. So I had that opportunity to be in Washington, D.C. and learn this from the bottom up. And at the time, it was very much focused on the care we give to others. But over the years, as I really studied and developed and practiced this work, it's really important that I adopted it as a bidirectional approach, that we can't exclude our humanity from the care we give to others. We're included in this care. And so a big component of the integrative model that I teach is looking at how do we resource ourselves? How do we include trauma-informed care in the care we give ourselves? So I love self-care. It's wonderful, but I look at self-care through a trauma-informed lens. So how do I apply these same strategies and methods and concepts of consent and agency and pace and transparency? How do I apply all these things to myself? Which is, if I'm going to be honest, usually very hard, because I'm really good at giving it to others and not so good at giving myself, right? It's a very, unfortunately, common thing. And again, for context, I do a lot of I wear a lot of hats professionally. But one big hat that I talk a lot about, because it's not always seen on social media and things, is that I'm a caregiver. I've been a caregiver for my mom and dad for the last 15 years. My mom has Alzheimer's. My dad recently passed away, and my mom is in hospice. So that's like my full-time job, is taking care of them. And there's a lot of grief, there's a lot of stress. And again, I live in the US. We do not care about our elders. We do not have access to healthcare. The only way to age well in this country is if you have a lot of money or you have a ton of support. And my parents, I'm an only child. I have an amazing family, but there's limited, and also they didn't have the means. So that I have had a very interesting and valuable lessons over the years of how to practice trauma-informed self-care as I navigate some really intense caregiving moments. And for me, and especially I have a very large capacity. I can hold a lot. I value that. I've worked at building my capacity. I can go deep with people. It's something I think is something I've worked on consistently. And I also think part of it is just a gift I have. And I tend to that gift. And I don't always do well, right? Perfection is not real. That was one of the biggest tenets of my anti-racism work, is divesting from perfectionism. But for me, I have to look at my nervous system care. And especially now, is like there's the collective world, and then there's like my community, and then there's like my world. So I'm looking at, how do I slow things down? How do I renegotiate priorities? How do I we think of consent. How do I practice self-consent? And my favorite tool is, what can I write myself a permission? What can I give myself permission to do, to feel, to say yes to say no to say not right now? To really block time out so I make sure that I can really decompress. Touching grass or a tree or like being outside to co-regulate with nature, really cultivating a beautiful support team and letting them support me, which is really, I'm good at supporting people, but not so good at receiving. And grace, just a lot of grace. Trauma-informed care is grace in action. And, not getting hung up on certain things, really just attuning to where I might be getting stuck and filtering in grace, prioritizing rest more, even though it's hard sometimes. And saying I don't know when I don't know, and just being transparent and honest with people. If I don't have I want to do something, but I just don't have the capacity, just being transparent. So all of these skills of trauma-informed care apply to ourselves. It just takes a little effort because we're not always so used to giving it externally, but not so much internally.
Absolutely. And the word that just keeps coming up is boundaries. Boundaries just keeps coming up as you're sharing everything there. For somebody who this is brand new work, or maybe they've heard about it and they're wondering, how do I begin? How do I get into this? I'm a coach. How can I be more aware of holding space, particularly those who have experienced trauma? How can I be more not just aware, but where can I begin this work? What would you say to somebody who asked that?
Yeah. I mean, that first step is just coming into the space with an open-minded heart and opting for curiosity over judgment. To really get into this work, there's so many paths. I mean, some books behind me, there's so many books, there's so many podcasts, there's so many people who have their own interpretations, that have their own viewpoints. And same for me. And so finding, who resonates with you most, what you're specifically, interested in, is a great place to start. I'm unique in that the approach that I teach is inclusive for any profession. So my work spans across every profession because it can be adapted into no matter what kind of work you do. I have a podcast called A Trauma-Informed Future, and actually the first 4 episodes are designed to be a little bit of an introductory kind of crash course. Because the first place I always suggest people starting is creating shared language and understanding. Like, really, what are these words mean? What does it mean? What are we talking about? And that's a great place I like to tell people to start. I have a free aware guide that kind of goes over these competency levels to help create shared language around awareness. Trauma informed, what does it mean to be trauma responsive? Because that's a big one too, where people start to think, oh, I'm trauma informed, and they swing to the extreme that they think they're now therapists, and like, no, we want to come back to neutral.
Yeah.
And I do a lot of training. I'm in progress of re-rolling out my online trainings. But a great lesson this year has been, I had all these goals and plans, and then lifed, and I had to really reckon with my business and my planning and let things, release this timeline, and let, things shift and adapt. And being adaptable and flexible is part of being trauma informed. And being community, there's some great people out there, following people. The Integrate Network is a beautiful community of trauma informed leaders that generously shares tons of information. And again, it can feel flooding. It can feel like a lot. And we need to remember to pace yourself. And you have time. As Resmaa Menakem, one of my teachers, always says, is like, we have time. So try to slow down and pace yourself.
I love that. I will say this because Katie is probably too graceful not to say this, but I want to make a recommendation for you, dear listener, who has, been taking all this in and, you'd love to get to know Katie a little bit more. She has a trauma-informed leadership studio membership, and I am a founding member of that. I'm a part of that. And that is a space that for me, I felt I absolutely, full body wanted to be a part of. And the conversations that we have in there, the circles, they've just been so enriching, and also just to be in community with people who have very similar values, who want the kind of world that you want. And the connections that are being made there are just so beautiful. And so tell us a little bit about TILS, Kate.
Yeah, thank you. So I I live my work lies in two kind of worlds. I do a lot of work with individuals who wish to adopt a trauma-informed approach and into their life, which means their personal and professional lives. And then I also do a lot of work with companies, small businesses, and larger corporate companies, whether it's universities, hospitals, what have you. And I work with teams on creating a culture of care. So that's what I'm kind of doing, a balancing act of my everyday work life. And when I work with companies, I always ensure that I'm not doing some sort of one and done training with them, because that wouldn't be honoring the fidelity of this approach. I always add integration support sessions after, where we can just like, let's talk, bring questions, like, how's it going? Because there's a lot to marinate. There's a lot of information to soak in. And this is something I wanted to do for the individuals I work with. But again, life is lifing, and priorities get shifted. And I'm only one person. I can only do so much. And so I really, this year was like, I really feel called to do this. I'm going to start this membership model, but really want it to feel like this studio, like a brick and mortar space you would go to and just find your people. We
Yeah.
speak the same language. We have shared values, where you can dip in and out based on your capacity. It's there for you to join, and make it not to be exclusionary, but it's okay to be transparent when things are exclusive, and say, this is for trauma-informed leaders. This is where we can come together to access continuing education, right? Because it is an evolution, but where are we evolving? And it can feel really lonely out there, especially for individuals who are the only people speaking this language and doing this work in their workplace or communities. And so the Trauma Informed Leadership Studio is, yes, a kind of a quintessential online membership, but I really curated it and wanted it to feel like this place where you didn't feel the pressure to have to, engage constantly or constantly keep up with an active feed, but rather a more leisurely and autonomous place for you to come in and out of when you need it, and to pace yourself, but know we're always here for your evolution as a trauma-informed leader. So there's a resource library that's regularly updated. There's continuing education workshops that are regularly updated. Not a lot, because I don't want to overwhelm people, especially if you're a person that like needs to do all the things at once. We're trying to model pacing. And then we have practice circle calls 2 or 3 times a month to honor the time zones. We have people representing 6 different continents in our membership. So it's not perfect. Time zone sorting that out is tricky, but we come together, and it's just a space to be witnessed, to be heard, to ask questions, to get peer support, to work through things, whatever it needs to be. That's what it is. And so it's a really beautiful space. I'm so honored to be in it. I always say, like, I'm in this with you.
Yes.
But I hope it can be hard. I'm the first one to admit it's easy to get overwhelmed with all the options and the things online. And that's why I really wanted to be like a no pressure zone where people can kind of come in and out, but be anchored to a community.
I love the model. I love the no pressure, and I can attest to this. There isn't pressure like you need to have gone through this, or there's all this information that's coming at you. It is such a good pace. And when you show up, you're not showing up having done this work or read this or this, like you're showing up as you are wherever you are, and space is being held. You're learning from others who are sharing. It is just one of those spaces that for me has just really added on to my well-being in a very, very big way. And it felt like it was a non-negotiable for me. It was a full body yes. And so if this is something that you are interested in as you're listening to this, I'll pop the link in the show notes so that you go and check it out. Would love, love, love for you all to join us if this is something that's calling to you. My final question to you, Katie, because there are so many things we didn't cover. And I feel like we need to have a part two. You need to come back again.
Happy to.
If fear wasn't a factor, how would you show up in your work?
Wow. I think that's so interesting. I feel like this is a beautiful invitation to really sit with, but in this moment, the biggest fears I feel are often lingering are very much connected to my own childhood trauma. And so it's really, if I were able to kind of repave the path, and which I have done a lot of healing work, but I think for me, it would be being able to show up with more clarity, less doubt, less fear of failure. And so much of it, again, is rooted in perfectionism. And that is my daily unhooking. And that's my liberation work, is really liberating myself from these very deep white supremacist notions of what I should be as a white woman in this country. And my own high expectations that are honestly quite ridiculous if I were to say them out loud. And I would never have those expectations for anyone else, but for some reason I do for myself. So I think right now where I'm really at are those things. But yeah, thank you for that question. I'm going to journal about that tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing so vulnerably and so openly. Where can people find you? They're listening to this and they're like, okay,
yeah.
I need to connect.
Thank you. Well, I would love to connect with people in the studio, or the podcast is also a great place to be. Anna, you were one of our inaugural guests, and I just love going deep into these nuanced conversations there. I really spend most of my time either on Instagram, and I've been loving LinkedIn. I was a skeptic, but I actually really love it over there. Lots of great folks to connect with, a lot of really interesting people doing this work, a lot of beautiful examples of the intersection of trauma-informed care and anti-racism, liberation, decolonizing work, which I love to see. So feel free to say hi over in those places. I'm always the person behind the account. I probably shouldn't be on my phone that much, but it's the life of an online business owner, right? And then I'm also in Cleveland, Ohio, if anyone happens to be local. I do a lot of work in person here. I'm starting to do more in-person space holding and workshops as well.
Beautiful. I'm going to pop all of those links in the show notes for you all to check it out. Katie Kurtz, Professor Kurtz, thank you so much for I had to slip that one in. Thank you so much for your time. I have loved this conversation, and come back again, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm honored. It's always such a joy to be in conversation with you on sometimes all the platforms. I love it. So thanks, Annie.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. Pimbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.
Represented from coast to coast.